Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're basically tearing down everything you thought you knew about one of the absolute most ubiquitous services in cloud computing. I mean, if you think Amazon S3 is just some giant passive hard drive in the sky where your files go to sit quietly, well, you're missing the bigger picture. We're going to uncover the secret life of AWS S3 and see how it acts not just as storage, but as a super dynamic platform running modern architecture. So let me ask you, how are you currently using S3? Right now. If you're like most developers out there, you probably think of it as just a destination. You use it for application assets, config files, backups. It's just a place where things are put simply so that they exist somewhere safe, right? Kind of like a digital dumping ground. But treating S3 like a passive bucket, that's actually massively underestimating its power. And honestly, it might be putting your entire infrastructure at risk. So the crucial point is that we really need to shift our mindset. We have to move away from seeing S3 as this passive destination and start understanding it as an active platform. It's not just a place where files go to rest. It is an active design decision. Literally, every single time you configure a bucket, you aren't just allocating storage. You're actually laying down the architectural foundation of your entire system. Here is how we're going to dismantle these misconceptions today. First, we'll look at how S3 is a design decision. Then, we'll cover the active trigger, followed by the server that isn't there. After that, we'll dive into S3 and the data ecosystem, and finally, wrap up with a really critical operational warning about the load-bearing realization.
All right, part 1. S3 is a design decision, going way beyond simple storage.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 2, the active trigger, specifically looking at event notifications. So the first real secret life of S3 is its ability to act as an active trigger. Walk through this workflow with me for a second. Step 1, a file arrives in your S3 bucket. Step 2, S3 instantly fires off a notification. And step 3, that notification is intercepted by a Lambda function, an SQSQ, or maybe an SNS topic, which then actually processes it. I mean, just think about the power of this. This is a completely automated, event-driven pipeline. There are no scheduled cron jobs checking for new files every minute. You don't have servers sitting idle, just constantly polling and waiting to see if work needs to be done. The event itself is the trigger. S3 is the entry point. To show you how this scales in the real world, let's look at some specific examples. Say an image gets uploaded to S3. Bam! That upload directly triggers a Lambda function that generates thumbnails and drops them right back into S3. Or maybe a CSV file gets dropped into a bucket, and a function instantly kicks off to validate, transform, and load that data straight into your database. Even a log file getting archived can trigger a processing job that extracts metrics for your dashboard. In all of these scenarios, S3 isn't just passively storing the file. S3 is actually starting the work. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact paradigm shift we're talking about here. S3 is the mouth of the river, not the lake at the end. Data enters there, and then it flows from there. Literally everything downstream in your system depends entirely on what flows from S3 upstream in that bucket. Moving right along to part 3, the server that isn't there. Let's talk about static hosting. Let's compare these environments for a minute. You can host a completely functional website directly from S3. With a traditional web server, you're looking at requiring EC2 instances, managing endless operation system updates, and doing all this complex capacity planning just to handle traffic spikes. But with S3 static hosting, there's zero server software, it's fully managed, and when you front it with CloudFront, it just automatically scales to serve millions of requests without you even lifting a finger. It was a genuinely radical idea when it first became possible, Just removing the server from the critical path entirely and swapping it for a managed service that costs like almost nothing at rest. Now, just to be super clear, static hosting serves what is there. It doesn't compute things on the server side. The front end lives in S3, while the dynamic backend lives over in Lambda or EC2, calling external APIs for backend logic. So S3 is serving up the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and images directly to browsers over HTTP. For completely client-side applications, think React apps or documentation sites, S3 isn't just storing assets for a web application. From the browser's perspective, S3 is the web application. All right, on to part 4, S3 and the data ecosystem, the landing zone. Think about application logs, clickstream data, IoT sensor readings. At massive scale, literally all of it flows into S3 first. It's your landing zone. And the reason S3 is so ridiculously powerful here really comes down to one core concept: schema on read. With your traditional database, you have to define the structure before the data even arrives. But S3? It imposes absolutely no schema. Raw data arrives in whatever format it arrives in, and the structure is only applied later on when you actually query it. This flexibility is incredible, mainly because you don't need to know what questions you're going to ask of your data before it even gets there. Let's move to and see how this builds into the broader AWS analytics ecosystem. S3 basically integrates directly with everything. You've got Athena, which lets you query data sitting right in S3 using standard SQL without having to load it into a database first. You've got Glue to catalog and transform it. Redshift can load from S3 at massive scale for your data warehousing, and SageMaker, it can train machine learning models directly against the data stored right there. So S3 is not just one of many tools, it is the fundamental substrate that all these other analytics and ML services sit right on top of. Because S3 is that foundation, if your S3 architecture is wrong, well, every tool built on top of it inherits that wrongness. As the source text states perfectly, in AWS, configuration is architecture. Your partition strategy determines exactly how fast Athena can query. Your naming conventions dictate whether Glue can even catalog your data correctly. These aren't just simple storage settings, guys. These are fundamental architectural decisions that define the efficiency of your entire ecosystem. Which brings us to part 5, the climax of this explainer, the load-bearing realization and the massive danger of accumulation. We see S3 slowly drift into the critical path of an application through a pattern that happens all the time. A team builds a system, right? And they use S3 just for simple storage. It's just chilling in the background. But over time, the system grows. S3 is really convenient, so developers keep dumping new features there. Event notifications get added. The static front end moves over there. The big data pipeline lands there. And then one day, without anyone ever actually making a conscious choice, S3 is suddenly in the critical path of absolutely everything. The application literally cannot function without it. It became load-bearing, not by design, but by accumulation. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is looking at what happens when S3 drifts into that critical path unnoticed. It usually drags along the permissive default settings of a bucket that was never really meant to matter. If your bucket is load-bearing, you have to treat it like it is. You absolutely must review your access controls just as strictly as you would a production database. You need to enable versioning, define clear lifecycle policies, and meticulously document all your event configurations. A passive repository quietly becoming infrastructure without actually being updated to reflect that fact is just a complete disaster waiting to happen. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to really chew on. Go look at your own cloud architecture today. Is your bucket load-bearing by design or by accident? S3 has this funny tendency to become massively significant without ever really announcing itself. We have to use it deliberately, intentionally, and give it the respect its hidden power deserves. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. And seriously, I highly recommend running an audit of your AWS configurations the moment this finishes. Catch you next time.